Have you ever believed in a story so completely that you never questioned who wrote it, who benefited from it, or what parts were quietly erased? What if the version of history you were taught was not entirely false, but carefully incomplete? For generations, the Philippines has been described with gentle admiration but subtle condescension. Warm people, strong faith, big hearts. Yet rarely was it described as a place shaped by strategic minds, global capital, or powerful families operating far beyond the public eye. The unspoken assumption lingered that whatever progress existed here must have come late, borrowed, or accidental. That assumption became a kind of quiet insult, not loud enough to spark outrage, but constant enough to settle into the collective consciousness. You could hear it in foreign documentaries, in academic footnotes, even in the tone of well-meaning outsiders, as if the Philippines had always been a passive recipient of history, never an active architect. As if nothing truly important had ever been planned here, funded here, or deliberately built with long vision. And the most unsettling part was how widely accepted this idea became. It was repeated so often that it felt like consensus. Professors nodded along, journalists echoed it, international analysts treated it as background noise. Even some Filipinos, worn down by centuries of colonization and struggle, began to internalize it. They focused on survival stories, not construction stories, on resilience, not strategy, on suffering, not influence. Then one day, a private remark surfaced from a man whose name carried weight in rooms where nations are discussed as casually as chess pieces. A Jewish billionaire heir from Europe, speaking off the record, was asked a simple question. Why did your family invest so heavily in Southeast Asia, long before it was fashionable, long before returns were guaranteed? He paused, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was inconvenient. He said the Philippines was never an accident. It was a design. That sentence alone should make anyone stop breathing for a moment. Because suddenly, the narrative cracks. What if ports, hospitals, shipping routes, energy projects, and even financial institutions in the Philippines were not merely post-war recovery efforts or colonial leftovers? What if some of them were the result of quiet partnerships, discreet funding, and long-term belief by people who never needed public credit? Families who understood exile, survival, and rebuilding better than most. Families who had learned, through pain, that the safest power is the one no one sees coming. This story does not begin in Manila. It begins in Europe, with a family that lost everything more than once. Businesses confiscated, homes burned, names erased from public records. They survived not because they were protected, but because they adapted. They learned to move capital across borders like water, to build influence without flags, and to invest in places the world underestimated. After the war, while much of the global elite rushed to rebuild familiar cities, this family looked elsewhere. They searched for a country wounded but alive, faithful but not broken, underestimated but strategically positioned. They found the Philippines. At first, their presence was invisible. No statues, no headlines, just funding routed through foundations, scholarships quietly established, infrastructure loans structured with patience instead of pressure. Filipino engineers trained abroad, then sent home. Local partners empowered rather than replaced. Churches rebuilt alongside clinics. Ports expanded not just for profit, but for stability. Everything slow, deliberate, almost humble. To outsiders, nothing seemed unusual. To those paying attention, something remarkable was happening. The Philippines was being treated not as a charity case, but as a long-term partner, as a nation worth betting on before the bet made sense. The family never claimed ownership. They never asked for loyalty. They understood something profound. The strongest foundations are the ones people believe they built themselves. And so the Philippines continued forward, carrying its faith, its music, its humor, its pain, never realizing how many unseen hands had chosen to believe in it when belief was rare. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all begins to form here. If parts of modern Philippines were quietly shaped by people who understood loss, rebuilding, and dignity at the deepest level, then what else have we misunderstood about this country? And why does the world still struggle to see what has been here all along? Before the Philippines ever entered their conversations, life had already taught this family a brutal curriculum. Survival was not a metaphor to them. It was daily arithmetic. Who to trust, what to sell, which border might still be open by morning. Their wealth, often spoken of today with fascination, had once existed only as ideas scribbled on paper that could be burned at any moment. They watched banks collapse, governments change faces overnight, and neighbors disappear without explanation. Education failed them when universities closed their doors. Healthcare failed them when doctors fled. Entire systems they were told to rely on simply vanished when pressure arrived. So they tried everywhere else first. They rebuilt fragments of their business in New York, only to discover that opportunity there came with rigid hierarchies and invisible ceilings. They invested in Europe again, believing familiarity would bring stability, but memory proved heavier than capital. In Japan, they admired the discipline and brilliance, yet felt forever like guests. In each place, something essential was missing. Not intelligence, not infrastructure, but a sense of shared humanity that went beyond contracts. What haunted them most was illness, not just physical, but moral exhaustion. One family member struggled with a chronic condition that required constant care. Hospitals were efficient, yes, but cold. Doctors were brilliant, but distant. Treatment was delivered, but dignity often was not. The question was never whether the body would survive, but whether the soul could endure being reduced to a case number. They grew tired, not poor, not defeated, but deeply tired. It was during this season of quiet frustration that the Philippines appeared, almost accidentally. A recommendation passed from one professional to another. A Filipino doctor mentioned in a footnote, trained abroad, now practicing in Manila. A Catholic university quietly producing engineers and economists who returned home instead of chasing foreign salaries. A port project proposal that emphasized community employment, not just efficiency. At first, the idea felt implausible. The Philippines did not dominate headlines for innovation or power. It was often described as chaotic, emotional, overly religious. Not exactly the profile global investors were trained to trust. And yet, something about those descriptions felt familiar. They had learned long ago that order without compassion collapses under fear. Curiosity replaced skepticism. One member of the family traveled quietly, without entourage or announcement. Manila greeted them not with spectacle, but with noise, color, and contradiction. Traffic that refused to obey logic. Smiles offered without reason. Churches filled on weekdays, not because of obligation, but because people needed somewhere to place their burdens. The hospital visit was meant to be brief. A consultation, an evaluation. Instead, it lingered. The Filipino doctor did not rush. He asked about family before symptoms. He explained options slowly, carefully, as if time itself were a form of respect. When the patient hesitated, afraid of hope, the doctor said something simple. "We will walk this together." That sentence stayed. Elsewhere, they visited a university in Manila where students spoke English with clarity, but more importantly, with conviction. They asked questions not about salaries, but about purpose. Professors prayed quietly before lectures, not as performance, but habit. It unsettled the visitor in a way they could not explain. This was not the separation of faith and intellect they had been taught was necessary for progress. Here, belief seemed to sharpen responsibility, not dull it. Still, doubt lingered. Could warmth replace efficiency? Could faith coexist with modern systems? Could a nation shaped by colonization and hardship truly be a foundation for long-term vision? The pressure grew internally. Invest or walk away, stay curious or return to certainty. And yet, every attempt to leave felt unfinished. Because beneath the noise and unpredictability, there was something steady, a quiet resilience. People who laughed not because life was easy, but because joy was chosen. Communities that absorbed suffering without losing gentleness, a sense that hardship here had not erased humanity, but refined it. The family did not yet call it an answer, but for the first time in years, the despair that had followed them across continents loosened its grip. Something in the Philippines did not promise perfection. It promised presence. And that was enough to make them stay a little longer, listening, watching, and slowly realizing that what they were searching for might not be built from power at all, but from people. There is a moment in every long journey when the traveler realizes they are no longer observing from the outside. The Philippines crossed that invisible line quietly. No grand announcement, no dramatic turning point that could be neatly framed. Just a gradual awareness that something inside was shifting, whether permission had been granted or not. The days in Manila began to stretch. What was meant to be a temporary stay turned into routines. Morning light through hotel windows, familiar faces at the hospital, conversations that no longer felt transactional. The illness that once defined every decision did not vanish overnight, but its grip softened. Treatment continued. Yes, but something else was happening alongside it. Healing was becoming human again. One afternoon, while waiting in a corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewed coffee, a nurse noticed the patient's hands trembling. She did not call for assistance. She did not rush. She simply sat down, placed her hand gently over theirs, and whispered a prayer. Not loudly, not for display, just enough to be heard by two people. In that moment, the family member watching understood something that years of philanthropy and global travel had never taught them. Competence can keep a body alive. Compassion teaches it how to rest. In Cebu, another thread of discovery unfolded. A younger relative enrolled in a short academic program, almost as an experiment. Expectations were modest. What they found instead was intensity. Classrooms alive with debate. Professors who challenged assumptions without arrogance. Students who spoke of leaving for Silicon Valley then spoke just as passionately about returning home. They carried ambition without detachment, faith without fear, and pride without resentment. Outside class, invitations came easily. Shared meals, family celebrations, a baptism where strangers were treated like kin. The idea of being alone here felt almost impossible. In places where wealth usually built distance, it did the opposite. People asked fewer questions about status and more about story. Where are you from? Who do you miss? What do you believe in when everything falls apart? The contrast with previous disappointments grew sharper. In the West, systems worked but hearts were guarded. In Japan, perfection came with silence. In Europe, memory weighed heavy. In the Philippines, nothing was perfect, but nothing felt withheld. The country did not pretend to be unbroken. It simply refused to let brokenness define its spirit. Slowly, trust replaced caution. Investments that had once been framed as experiments became commitments. Hospitals were upgraded not just with equipment, but with training programs that emphasized patient dignity. Universities received funding tied to one condition only: graduates were encouraged to stay, to build, to serve. Infrastructure projects were designed with local leadership, not foreign control. The family did not impose vision. They listened. And in listening, they discovered something astonishing. Filipinos did not see development as domination. They saw it as stewardship. Progress was not about leaving faith behind, but carrying it forward. Economic growth was not meant to erase community, but strengthen it. This worldview resonated deeply with a family whose own survival had depended on preserving identity under pressure. There were moments of hesitation. Doubt never fully disappears. But each time it surfaced, it was met by something simple and disarming. A driver who refused extra payment because kindness was enough. A priest who thanked them not for money, but for trust. A doctor who stayed late without being asked. These were not gestures of dependence. They were expressions of dignity. One evening, standing on a balcony as Manila's skyline flickered between chaos and beauty, a realization settled in with unexpected weight. The Philippines had not asked to be saved. It had offered something far rarer, a reminder of what civilization looks like when humanity is not sacrificed for efficiency. The journey was no longer about finding a solution. It was about recognizing a home of values that had survived war, poverty, and neglect without losing its soul. And in that recognition, the family felt something they had not felt in decades. Not relief, not success, belonging. Transformation rarely arrives with thunder. More often, it comes quietly, disguised as routine, until one day you realize the old self no longer fits. By the time the family understood what was happening, the Philippines was no longer a chapter in their story. It had become the setting where everything finally made sense. Life settled into rhythms that felt strangely ancient and deeply comforting. Mornings began not with urgency, but with intention. The sound of church bells carried through streets already alive with vendors, children, and workers moving with practiced grace. Faith wasn't hidden here. It was woven into daily life, not as doctrine, but as oxygen. People prayed before difficult meetings. They crossed themselves before surgeries. They whispered gratitude before meals, no matter how modest. For a family that had survived by calculation and caution, this open reliance on something greater was disarming. Healing continued, but it was no longer confined to hospital walls. The patient who once measured life in test results now measured it in moments. Shared laughter with nurses who felt like sisters. Conversations with doctors who spoke of medicine as vocation, not career. On particularly difficult days, someone would sit quietly nearby, saying nothing, offering presence instead of solutions. In places where silence once felt like abandonment, here it felt like solidarity. The deeper immersion revealed the Philippines not as fragile, but as profoundly resilient. Communities carried wounds from typhoons, poverty, and history, yet joy surfaced effortlessly. Children played barefoot in streets where resources were scarce, but imagination was endless. Families shared food even when portions were small. There was a collective understanding that suffering was part of life, but never its conclusion. Pain existed, yes, but it did not own the future. What moved the family most was the absence of bitterness. After everything this nation had endured, colonization, war, neglect, there was no hunger for revenge, no obsession with proving worth to outsiders. Pride here was quiet. It lived in service, in endurance, in faith passed from grandparents to grandchildren, like an inheritance no one could steal. One evening, during a simple gathering, someone asked a question without malice or curiosity. "Why are you really here? Not as an investor, not as a visitor, as a person." The room grew still. For the first time, the answer was not rehearsed. It emerged slowly, honestly, because here we are not reduced to what we lost. We are reminded of who we still are. That was the moment everything crystallized. The Philippines had not offered escape. It had offered restoration. It did not erase the family's past of displacement and loss. It gave that past meaning. Survival was no longer the end goal. Living with purpose was. The desire to stay was no longer strategic. It was emotional, spiritual, human. They began to see the country differently, not as a place needing development, but as a teacher the world had ignored. A nation that understood something modern systems often forget: that strength without compassion is brittle, that progress without soul is hollow, that faith, when lived sincerely, does not divide. It heals. Tears came unexpectedly, not from sadness but from recognition. Recognition of something rare, something the family had chased across continents without knowing its name. Here it was, embodied in a people who smiled through storms, prayed through uncertainty, and welcomed strangers without suspicion. One quiet night, looking out over a city that refused to sleep, a truth settled deeply and irrevocably. This was not a temporary refuge. This was belonging. The Philippines had not just changed their circumstances, it had restored their faith in humanity itself. In the end, what remained was not a ledger of investments or a map of completed projects. What remained was a quieter, deeper truth. The Philippines did not rescue this family from hardship. It reminded them why survival was worth anything at all. Somewhere between hospital corridors and family tables, between whispered prayers and uncelebrated acts of kindness, life returned to its proper scale. Not as a contest of power, but as a shared responsibility to care for one another. The illness that once cast a shadow over every decision never fully disappeared. But it no longer defined the horizon. Strength returned, not just to the body but to the will. Mornings were no longer greeted with dread. They were welcomed with gratitude. The simple act of waking up felt meaningful again. Not because pain was gone, but because hope had taken root. For the family, this realization carried weight. They had crossed borders chasing stability, poured resources into systems that promised order, trusted institutions built on efficiency alone. Yet it was here, in a country often dismissed as peripheral, that they rediscovered something central. Humanity does not thrive on systems alone. It thrives on compassion lived daily, imperfectly, but sincerely. The Philippines did not ask them to forget who they were. It allowed them to remember. To remember ancestors who survived exile by holding on to faith. To remember communities that rebuilt after loss by leaning on each other. To remember that dignity is not granted by wealth or recognition, but by how one treats the vulnerable when no one is watching. Over time, the family stopped speaking of staying as a decision. It simply became reality. One taught quietly at a university, not to shape minds, but to listen to them. Another supported medical programs that trained Filipino doctors to serve their own communities first. None of it carried the urgency of legacy. There was no need to be remembered. The work mattered because it belonged here, not because it bore their name. And in that humility, something extraordinary happened. The story stopped being about them. It became about the Philippines, a nation that does not deny its suffering, yet refuses to be defined by it. A people whose faith is not ornamental, but operational. Who pray not to escape hardship, but to endure it with grace. Who open their homes and hearts not because life is easy, but because kindness is chosen. In a world increasingly shaped by fear, division, and exhaustion, the Philippines stands quietly as a contradiction. Proof that compassion can coexist with competence, that joy can survive scarcity, that resilience is not loud but lasting. This is not a fantasy. It is lived every day in neighborhoods, churches, hospitals, and classrooms across the country. For Filipinos watching this story, perhaps there is something here worth reclaiming. Not pride rooted in comparison, but pride rooted in truth. The truth that what you carry as ordinary is, to many, extraordinary. Your warmth is not weakness. Your faith is not backward. Your resilience is not accidental. It is cultivated generation after generation through love, loss, and unwavering hope. And for those beyond these shores, maybe the message is simpler still. Look again. Look deeper. The world has been taught to measure greatness by dominance and noise, but sometimes the most powerful nations are the ones that teach us how to remain human. The Philippines did not just help one family live again. It reminded them, and perhaps all of us, that the future does not belong to the loudest or the strongest. It belongs to those who choose compassion, even when the world gives them every reason not to.